So I've made these various cabinet pieces to go in the upstairs studio. I'm getting ready to epoxy them today, so we're going to show you just a little overview of that part of the process. All the tops of these pieces are made of either MDF plywood, which is very heavy, very dense, but it takes you can route it, make good edges on the side of it. Or they're made with a preformed tabletop that was made of hardboard, chipboard, that already had a preformed edge to them. Just reusing that material. Made the cabinets, they're ready to put together when we go upstairs. So this is the top of my studio table. It'll go on these side pieces. What I've done to prepare all of this wood for epoxy is I primed it with just Kills primer, kind of sanded it down just a little bit, get up any paints and dribs sticking up high. I've then taken just regular Rust-Oleum white spray paint and hit it a few times, and then I've come back with another gray paint, spray paint, and just kind of did some odd spray patterns across it. What that does is it gives shadowing to the epoxy. The epoxy is slightly transparent when it goes on here, so this gives depth so it looks like you have rock where you have multiple layers of different shadows up underneath it. One thing when you're doing any kind of epoxy work is your pieces have to be extremely level where you're pouring the epoxy on. This piece has a back part on it, so I will have to do it in 2 pours. I'll have to get this level, pour the epoxy in it. We'll show you that later on. Then flip it up, get this piece here prepped, and pour epoxy on this, so then it becomes a seamless epoxy pour between those 2 pieces. Because the epoxy is liquid when you pour it, it has to be contained on your level surface, and regular masking tape works great for that. You just take a piece and attach it on your edge of your piece that you're pouring the epoxy on, seal it around the edge, have it stick up, and when you have a long piece of masking tape and you pour the epoxy on it, it wants to kind of push over and flow off the top of the masking tape. So what I found is just a little piece of sheet metal I can cut. Tape on the side creates enough of resistance to hold that in place. And just take a couple of those, put it where they stick up also, tape it down good, and put just a small piece of tape to hold it to the tape that's on there. I'll put a couple more pieces of the sheet metal around this piece because it's about 20 inches long. When I made all the countertops inside the house, I didn't have a problem with bugs in there. Out here in the carport, I have to worry about bugs landing on the epoxy when it's wet. It really is tacky for about 24 hours. So our solution to that has been we got a very cheap greenhouse structure online, set it up in another part of the carport over here. I can do about 3 of these pieces at a time in there, but it has vent windows. We can seal it and keep the bugs out of it while it cures overnight. I'm going to go ahead and tape all these up. We'll move the pieces in. I'll make sure they're level because they have to be level on the top has to be level for the pour. We'll come back later and we'll do a pour on some of these. You can see how that process goes. I've got the 3 counters in here that I'm going to do today. I put plastic down to protect the concrete floor so I don't have to clean it too much afterwards. I wanted to do a 4th counter in here today, but I don't have a lot of room in this little greenhouse, so I'm only going to do these 3. These 3 countertops measure out to right around 15 square feet of surface I'll be covering today. And that works out pretty good for me. A gallon of the epoxy covers 20 square feet. So 15 square feet will be 3 quarts. And I want my epoxy to have a very light look to it when I mix it up. So I'm going to mix up 2 quarts with white epoxy and 1 quart with black epoxy. Mix them together on the surface, get the veining and modeling look of marble on here. That makes very easy math to do when we start using the measuring cups. So at this point, the only tools I really need to do what I'm going to do today are the epoxy. I've got A and B epoxy. This is from Stone Coat Epoxy Coatings. There's other epoxies available. I like this particular one because you mix equal portions of A and B. Some of them you mix different amounts and ratios. You have to have different kind of equipment to make sure you get the right proportions. I have these measuring cups that hold 2.5 quarts, but I'll be using a quart. I'll be using 2 quarts in this one and 1 quart in this one. I'll actually fill it halfway to the 32 ounces with part A, add 32 ounces of part B, get it mixed up good, then I'll use the color to add to it. For mixing, I have a couple of stout mixing sticks. And if you notice, I've actually broken these off so they have a little bit of a sharp edge on one edge end. I like that later on. I'll show you that. Rubber gloves. I have extra gloves available because I end up breaking them as I do this. And then I have an electric heat gun that I've put some tape around some of the areas where my hands are going to be hitting on it because I'm going to have epoxy on my gloves and it's going to get on the heat gun. I just want to try to minimize the mess a little bit. And my color I'm going to use today are 2 cans of Rust-Oleum spray enamel. These are flat sprays. I could use semi-gloss, even glossy. It doesn't really matter too much about that. There are some things that you can't use other paint brands with this. The Rust-Oleum seems to work good. You can buy dyes from the epoxy manufacturers to add to your epoxy instead of using the paint, but this works good. With my countertops, I want them to be kind of light, so I'm going to make 2 quarts of the white epoxy using the Rust-Oleum paint to add the color to it. I'll make 1 quart of the black epoxy using the black paint for it. Put them on the countertop. I'll start mixing them around. Once I see what the color actually looks like on the surface, if it's too dark for what I want or the look I'm looking for, I can then spritz some of the white spray paint on it and work it in while it's all wet, and gives a good effect. Now, there's no exact measurement on how to do the paint, but it can go up to about 5% of the volume of the epoxy. Kind of mix it around and get an idea what if it's still translucent or not. If it's still translucent, I'm going to add a little bit more color to it. Thank you. And then I am going to pour it on those countertops. I'm just going to kind of get it about half on that one. And some black. And now the fun part. Hands. Just kind of work it around. Mix black and white together. Try to cover everywhere. I'm covering all the little dry spots with the epoxy. As I said, I'm just going to spritz some more lightning in here. Certain places. Kind of work it around a little bit more. Okay, and then I use the heat gun to basically burn out any bubbles. Heat it up. It works out the bubbles. I mean, the air moving around makes some patterns in it also. And if I want to add some veining, I simply take this and wherever you break the pattern, it basically, when it forms back on itself, it creates little micro patterns. Or if I want a little bit more obvious pattern, add just a little bit of the So this will sit for about 3 hours out here, and the epoxy will start to harden up some. When it gets to a certain tackiness to it, where it's still liquid but not wanting to flow quickly, I'll remove the tape around the edges, and then this pattern will just wrap over the edges and cover all those rounded edges that we made on these pieces. It's been about 3 hours now. The epoxy that was left in the pour buckets has gotten pretty hardened up, but it's still liquidy. But it looks like it's about the right phase where I can pull this tape around the outside of the countertops. And basically all I'm doing here is just removing, trying to get a handhold, just removing it as I do. The epoxy will just flow over the edges here. It'll keep that pattern as it goes over around it. It'll take a couple of hours to flow over the edge. I'll give it a few minutes to kind of flow by itself, and then I'll come back with my hands with gloves on them and kind of smear underneath just to help it, give it, kind of break the surface tension if it doesn't start flowing on its own. I'm just kind of pulling it down, and it's pulling that, keeping that pattern in it. And as this gets wet more, the epoxy will follow the wet edge and kind of flow that pattern down. You can see here how the variation just flows over the edge. And as it flows over by itself, it'll smooth out more. It'll sit in here another day or two, harden up really good. Then we'll get the other pieces done. These are the countertops done yesterday. There's some drips underneath where it rolled over the edges. Those will get chipped off and sanded up later on. This epoxy is still slightly soft. It'll continue to get harder over the next couple of days. So I'm going to move this out of the way, let it harden up really good. Might cut some of these drips off with a knife while they're still fairly soft and easy to cut. This piece we'll get tilted up and do the back edge. This is a high gloss finish on it right now. I'll come in with some fine sandpaper, dull it down just a little bit. I might add a matte finish to this. I have just enough of that left over to probably do that. So something I'll think about. It's been several days now since I poured the epoxy. It's nice and hard. There are the drips underneath the edge here where the epoxy flowed over, carried the color pattern over. These drips I'll cut off with a angle grinder with a 40 grit sanding flat pad wheel on it. So I'll use the angle grinder to get the shape underneath, how I won't get all these drips off. I'll come back over with the orbital sander start with 320 grit sandpaper and work my way up just to make sure the tops are super smooth. Paint these cabinets, get them ready to go upstairs.